At Thanksgiving dinner, my parents physically removed my seat from the table because they said there was no room for disappointments. As I walked out, I dropped a foreclosure notice on my father's plate and whispered, "Happy Thanksgiving. I finally know why you hate me." The room went silent. What they discovered inside that envelope made 25 relatives gasp. My name is Nia, and at 29 years old, I had become the secret owner of the very house I was just kicked out of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The driveway of my parents' estate in Baldwin Hills was lined with luxury cars like a showroom for the black elite of Atlanta. There was my father's vintage Bentley, my mother's pearl-white Mercedes, and my sister Chloe's brand-new Range Rover, likely paid for by another loan my father took out. I parked my matte black Audi R8 down the street, hidden behind a large oak tree. I did not want them to know I was doing well. To them, I was still Nia, the college dropout, the black sheep who embarrassed the family name. I smoothed down my simple dress, took a deep breath, and walked up the long manicured path. The house looked like a fortress of perfection, looming over me with its massive pillars and perfect landscaping. Inside, I could hear the warm hum of laughter and jazz music. It was the sound of a perfect family gathering. But the moment I opened the heavy oak door, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The laughter cut off instantly. My aunties looked down at their drinks. My cousins pretended to check their phones. It was as if a ghost had entered the room. I walked straight toward the dining room, my heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. The smell of roasted turkey collard greens and candied yams filled the air, scents that used to mean comfort, but now smelled like rejection. The dining table was a masterpiece set with the finest china and crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier. Everyone was there. My father, Bishop Thomas, sat at the head of the table looking regal in his suit. My mother, Evelyn, was adjusting the floral centerpiece. And there was Chloe, my younger sister, sitting next to her white husband, Brad. They were glowing, the picture of success. I scanned the long table for my usual spot, the third chair on the left next to the window. It was gone. The gap where my chair used to be had been completely closed up. The place setting was removed. Instead, Brad was sitting comfortably with his legs stretched out wide, his expensive loafers occupying the exact space where my feet should have been. He looked up at me, a smirk playing on his lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He didn't move his legs. He simply expanded his presence, claiming the territory that was once mine. The message was loud and clear before a single word was spoken. I was not just unwelcome. I was erased. I looked straight at my mother, Evelyn. She was sitting there like a queen on a throne, her fingers wrapped around a crystal goblet. She took a slow sip of wine, leaving a perfect crimson stain on the rim of the glass from her expensive lipstick. I cleared my throat and asked Mother, "Where's my chair? Is this some kind of mistake?" Evelyn finally turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were cold, devoid of any maternal warmth. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a hug. She simply let out a long, weary sigh, as if my mere presence was exhausting her. "Nia," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she used when she wanted to be cruel. "There is no mistake. We simply had to make adjustments. This table is reserved for those who contribute to this family's legacy. For those who make us proud." She gestured gracefully toward my sister. "Look at Chloe. She is carrying the next generation of our bloodline. Look at Brad. He is expanding the business. We have to prioritize our assets." Chloe, who was glowing in a designer maternity dress that cost more than my first car, let out a high-pitched giggle. She placed a protective hand over her barely visible baby bump, flashing her massive diamond ring in the process. "Oh, Mom, stop!" Chloe said, her voice thick with false sympathy, while her eyes danced with malice. "Don't be so harsh. Nia can't help it if she's still figuring things out. Maybe she can sit in the den. The game is on, right?" She looked up at her husband, Brad, and they shared a secret, mocking smile. It was a performance, and I was the punchline. I turned to my father, hoping for some defense. Bishop Thomas, the man who preached about love and forgiveness every Sunday to a congregation of 5,000 people. But he refused to even look at me. He kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the leather-bound Bible next to his plate, his lips moving silently as if he were deep in prayer. He was using God as a shield to hide from his own cruelty. He knew exactly what was happening, and his silence was his endorsement. He would rather read scripture than look his eldest daughter in the eye and treat her with basic human dignity. My mother turned back to me, her face hardening, dropping the facade of sweetness entirely. As I said, Nia, we have guests. Brad needs legroom, Chloe needs comfort, and quite frankly, this dining room has limited space. There is simply no room for disappointments at this table. Your chair has been put in the garage. You are welcome to fix yourself a plate and eat in the kitchen with the staff. That is if you plan to stay. I stood there feeling the blood drain from my face. The old Nia would have cried. The old Nia would have begged for a spot on the floor just to be included. But as I looked at my mother's smug face, my father's cowardly silence, and my sister's mocking grin, something inside me snapped. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt clarity. They thought they were shaming me, but they were actually freeing me. I did not turn toward the kitchen as my mother commanded. Instead, I unzipped my leather tote bag. The sound of the metal zipper teeth separating was sharp and loud in the silent room. Every eye followed my hand as I reached inside. I wasn't pulling out a Tupperware container to beg for leftovers. I pulled out a thick, bright yellow FedEx envelope. It was heavy, packed with legal documents that had arrived at my office just yesterday morning. I walked slowly around the long dining table. I passed Brad, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling his legs back as if he suddenly realized he was trespassing. I passed Chloe, whose smirk faltered just a fraction when she saw the serious expression on my face. I stopped directly behind my father, Bishop Thomas. He was still staring at his Bible, refusing to acknowledge the daughter standing over his shoulder. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of the roasted turkey. Without saying a word, I leaned over. I didn't hand the envelope to him. I didn't place it on the table. I dropped the heavy package directly onto his dinner plate, right on top of the slice of turkey he was about to eat. The impact made a loud clatter against the fine bone china. Gravy splattered onto the pristine white tablecloth and spotted his silk tie. My father jumped, finally snapping his head up. His eyes went wide with shock and then immediate anger. He looked at the gravy on his tie, then at the yellow envelope violating his perfect holiday meal. "Nia," he boomed, his voice shaking the crystal glasses. "Have you lost your mind? How dare you throw trash on my table? Get out! Get out of my house before I call the police." I didn't flinch at his shouting. I had spent my whole life flinching, and I was done. I leaned in close, resting my hands on the back of his chair, invading his personal space the way he had invaded my peace for years. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad," I said, my voice calm and terrifyingly steady. "I finally understand why you hate me. You hate me because you think I have no value. But you know who doesn't hate me. The National Bank. In fact, they love me. They love me so much that they just sold me your debt." I tapped the yellow envelope with my manicured fingernail. "Open it. See for yourself who really owns the chair you are sitting in." My father stared at the yellow package sitting on his turkey as if it were a bomb. And in a way it was. His hands, usually so steady when he was asking the congregation for tithes, were trembling noticeably. He wiped his greasy fingers on a napkin and snatched the envelope up. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the room, sharp and violent. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. The top page was stamped in aggressive red ink. "Final notice of foreclosure." Bishop Thomas squinted at the document, his eyes scanning past the legal jargon to the bottom line. The color drained from his face instantly, leaving him looking gray and old. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "NJ Holdings," he whispered, his voice cracking. This says the new lien holder is NJ Holdings. That is your company. You bought our debt. My mother Evelyn snatched the papers from his hands, nearly knocking over her wine glass. She scanned the page frantically. Then she let out a sound I had never heard her make. It wasn't the poised, polite laugh of a bishop's wife. It was a guttural scream of pure terror. Thomas, she shrieked, clutching the paper to her chest. It says effective immediately. It says we are trespassing in our own home. She looked at me with wild eyes. You can't do this. This is my house. Chaos erupted. My Aunt Sheila dropped her fork, the metal clattering against the china. Chloe stopped rubbing her belly and looked at Brad, whose face had gone completely pale. He knew exactly what NJ Holdings was, and he knew exactly how ruthless we were with delinquent accounts. The silence was replaced by 25 people, gasping, whispering, and scraping their chairs back. The facade of the perfect family dinner shattered into a million pieces. I didn't stay to watch them scramble. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their sudden apologies. I simply turned on my heel and began to walk away. Nia, my father bellowed, standing up so fast his chair toppled over backward with a loud crash. Nia, come back here! You cannot do this! We are your family! I kept walking, past the expensive art on the walls that now belonged to me, past the grand staircase I used to scrub on my hands and knees because my mother said it built character. I walked straight to the heavy front door. As I reached for the handle, I heard my mother sobbing, asking how they were going to fix this. They couldn't. That was the point. I opened the door to the cool night air and stepped out, letting the heavy wood slam shut behind me, silencing their screams. I didn't look back once. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, muffling the sounds of 25 relatives screaming at once. The night air in Baldwin Hills was crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dining room I had just escaped. I walked down the long, winding driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. I passed my father's prized rose bushes, which he paid a gardener $3,000 a month to maintain, even though I now knew he hadn't paid his mortgage in 8 months. It was pathetic. It was all smoke and mirrors. I reached the large oak tree at the end of the cul-de-sac where I had parked. My car sat there in the shadows, blending perfectly with the darkness. It was a matte black Audi R8 with carbon fiber trim. My family thought I drove a rusted-out Honda Civic. They thought I scraped by selling used clothes online. They had no idea that the vehicle waiting for me was worth more than Chloe's entire wedding budget. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of premium leather filled my senses, grounding me. This was my reality, the luxury, the power, the silence. This was the life I had built from the ashes they left me in. I pressed the start button on the dashboard. The V10 engine roared to life with a low, aggressive growl that vibrated through my chest. It sounded like a beast waking up ready to hunt. I was about to shift into gear when the interior of the car lit up with blinding white light. My phone, which I had tossed onto the passenger seat, began to vibrate violently. It buzzed and danced across the leather upholstery like it was possessed. I glanced over at the screen. The notifications were cascading down like a digital waterfall. One text from Mom read, "Nia, come back inside instantly. We can talk about this. Do not make a scene." Another from Chloe read, "You are a liar. Dad says that paper is fake. You are just jealous of my baby." Then a text from Brad, the only one who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, read, "Please tell me you didn't actually buy the debt. We can work something out. Call me." I let out a dry laugh. Work something out. Now they wanted to negotiate. 10 minutes ago I wasn't even worth a chair. Now I was the most important person in their contacts list. A new notification popped up. A voicemail from Contact Bishop Thomas. My father. He must have called while I was walking down the driveway. I hesitated for a split second, my finger hovering over the screen. Part of me, the little girl who just wanted her daddy to love her, wanted to delete it unheard. But the woman who just bought his house needed to hear his fear. I pressed play and turned up the volume. My father's voice filled the cabin of the Audi. It wasn't the polished, soothing baritone he used on Sunday mornings to charm donations out of little old ladies. This was the real Thomas. His voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. "Nia," he screamed through the speakers. "You ungrateful little witch. I command you to turn around right now. You think you can humiliate me in my own house. I will disown you. I will cut you off from everything. You hear me? You are nothing without this family." I didn't let him finish the threat. I simply tapped the screen. Block caller. Then I went to my mother's contact. Block caller. Chloe. Block caller. Brad. Block caller. One by one I silenced them. The cabin returned to a peaceful quiet, save for the low hum of the engine. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. I checked the rearview mirror one last time. The lights in the dining room were still blazing, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. I wasn't the disappointment anymore. I was the landlord. And rent was due. 30 minutes later, the matte black Audi slid into the private underground garage of the Skyline Tower. This was not just an apartment building in downtown Atlanta. It was a vertical fortress of steel and glass where NBA players and tech moguls hid from the world. I scanned my biometric pass and drove into my reserved spot next to a McLaren and a vintage Porsche. I took the private elevator straight up to the 45th floor. As the heavy steel doors slid open, the silence of my sanctuary welcomed me. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights below a glittering ocean of ambition that I had conquered. My parents thought I lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat on the bad side of town. They thought I struggled to pay my electric bill. They had absolutely no idea that I owned this entire floor. I walked across the Italian marble floors that were cool against my feet and headed straight for the master suite. It was time to shed the costume. I kicked off the scuffed flats I wore specifically to visit my parents. I unzipped the drab gray dress that screamed struggling artist and let it fall to the floor in a heap. It was a disguise, a uniform I put on to make them feel superior. For years I dimmed my light so they wouldn't have to squint. But tonight, I was done playing small. I walked into my walk-in closet, a space larger than the bedroom I grew up in, and pulled on a silk emerald green robe. The fabric felt like water against my skin, cool and luxurious. This was the real Nia. I walked to the wet bar in the living room and selected a bottle of vintage Cabernet. It was a 2015 Screamer worth more than Brad's car payment. I poured a generous glass, the dark red liquid swirling against the crystal. I walked out onto the balcony, letting the cold wind play with my hair as I looked down at the city. You are probably wondering how a college dropout who was kicked out of her family home at 18 affords a $5 million penthouse. My family thinks I sell vintage clothes on the internet or flip thrift store furniture. They call it my little hobby and laugh about it behind my back. They are wrong. I am what Wall Street calls a distressed asset investor. Some people call us vultures. I do not mind the name. Vultures are necessary. They clean up the mess. I do not sell clothes. I buy debt, bad debt, toxic debt, the kind of financial mistakes people try to hide. When companies go under, or when wealthy families overextend themselves trying to keep up appearances, I swoop in. I buy their distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, and then I enforce the terms, ruthlessly. It is a dirty business maybe, but it pays exceptionally well. It taught me one thing. Everyone has a breaking point. Everyone has a price. And tonight I finally found my family's price tag. I took a slow sip of the wine, tasting the notes of oak and dark berries. It tasted like victory. My father called me a disappointment. But looking out at the city I dominated, I realized he was right. I was a disappointment to his ego because I didn't need him. I didn't need his approval, his money, or his seat at the table. And the sweetest irony of all was that the money I used to buy his mortgage came from the very independence he tried to crush. Now I didn't just have a seat, I owned the whole game. I walked over to my desk, a slab of black marble that dominated the center of my home office. I tapped the keyboard and three curved monitors flickered to life, bathing the room in the cool blue glow of financial data. To the untrained eye, these screens looked like chaos. Rows of red and green numbers, jagged line graphs, and endless spreadsheets. But to me, this was a symphony. This was the pulse of the American economy, and right now I was listening to its heartbeat. My family thinks I make money selling vintage jackets on eBay. They laugh about it at their country club dinners. But the reality is that I operate in the shadows of the financial world where they would not survive 5 minutes. I am a distressed debt purchaser. In simple terms, when a bank gives up on collecting a loan because the borrower is too difficult or the legal fees are too high, they sell that debt to someone like me for pennies on the dollar. They sell the right to collect. They sell the power. I sat down in my leather chair and pulled up a portfolio I was currently analyzing. It was a failing luxury hotel chain in Miami. The owners were exactly like my parents, flashy on the outside, rotting on the inside. They were leveraging assets they didn't own to pay for lifestyles they couldn't afford. I zoomed in on their balance sheet. I could see the cracks in their foundation that nobody else noticed. I saw the missed payments to vendors. I saw the desperate loans taken out at high interest rates. This job requires a specific kind of personality. You have to be detached. You have to be willing to look at a family losing their legacy and see only a profit margin. Most people cannot do it. They have too much heart. But I have an advantage. My family spent 29 years surgically removing my empathy. They taught me that love is conditional and that weakness is punished. They created the perfect predator, and they did not even realize it. I clicked open a new window and brought up the file named Project Genesis. This was my personal favorite. It was the file on my parents. I had been tracking their financial decline for 2 years. It started small. A missed credit card payment here, a second mortgage there. Then came the loans for Chloe's wedding. Then the loans for Brad's failed startup. I watched the numbers turn red month after month. I watched them drowning while they were still smiling for the cameras. When the bank finally categorized their mortgage as a toxic asset, I was ready. I didn't use my own name. I used a shell company, NJ Holdings. I bought the note on their house for 60 cents on the dollar. It was the easiest negotiation of my career. The bank was desperate to get rid of Bishop Thomas and his excuses. I remember staring at the screen the day the transfer went through. I felt a rush of adrenaline that was better than any drug. I wasn't just buying a house, I was buying my dignity back. I was buying the very stage where they had performed their cruelty for decades. I leaned back in my chair and watched the stock ticker scroll across the bottom of the screen. They called me a failure because I didn't follow their path. But while they were playing house, I was buying the block. The blue light from my monitors reflects off the small jagged scar running down my left knee. It is a permanent reminder of the moment I stopped being a daughter and started being a soldier. 5 years ago, I was not sitting in a penthouse. I was lying in a crowded county hospital room that smelled of bleach and dried blood. It was raining. The kind of cold, relentless rain that soaks into your bones and refuses to leave. I had been T-boned at an intersection by a driver who ran a red light. My car was totaled and my leg was shattered in 2 places. I remember the pain. It was a blinding, white-hot agony that made it hard to breathe. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what happened when my parents walked through the door. I had called them in a panic. The surgeon told me I needed an immediate operation to reconstruct the ligament, or I would walk with a limp for the rest of my life. The problem was my insurance had a gap. I needed $5,000 up front to book the operating room. I was 24 years old, working double shifts as a waitress and paying off student loans. I had $300 to my name. When Bishop Thomas and Evelyn walked in, I felt a surge of relief. I thought they were there to save me. My mother was wearing a vintage mink coat that I knew cost at least $12,000. My father had on his custom Italian loafers. They looked like royalty visiting a peasant. They didn't hug me. They didn't kiss my forehead. My father stood at the foot of the bed and looked at my x-rays with a frown. $5,000 is a lot of money, Nia, my mother said, her voice sharp and annoyed. She checked her diamond watch as if my tragedy was making her late for a hair appointment. I begged them. I told them about the surgery. I told them I wouldn't be able to stand for my waitress shifts without it. I told them I was scared. My father sighed, the deep, heavy sigh of a man burdened by an inconvenient pet. We simply cannot do it right now, Nia, he said. Our liquidity is tied up. We just put a down payment on a new Mercedes C-Class for Chloe. She is starting her internship at the law firm next month, and she needs a reliable vehicle that reflects the family status. We cannot pull that money back. You will just have to let it heal naturally. God will provide. I stared at them. They were choosing a car for my healthy sister over the ability for me to walk. Chloe needed a car to match her ambition. I just needed to survive. They turned around and walked out of that hospital room, leaving me alone with the sound of the rain and the realization that I was completely on my own. I didn't get the surgery. I spent 6 months in physical therapy learning how to walk through the pain. But as my bone knit back together, so did my resolve. That night in the hospital was the night the old soft Nia died. I realized that money was not just currency. It was protection. It was the only language my parents understood. And I swore on my shattered leg that I would never be poor again. I would make so much money that I could buy and sell their precious Mercedes 1,000 times over. And now, 5 years later, here we are. They wanted to talk about liquidity. Well, I just liquidated their entire life. The road to owning my parents' estate was paved with their own arrogance and financial illiteracy. You see, people like Bishop Thomas and Evelyn believe that their status makes them immune to consequences. They believe that God will provide, so they stop doing the math. But math is vengeful, and it always collects what is owed. After I left the hospital with my shattered knee, I started watching their public records like a hawk. It did not take long to see the cracks in their foundation. The collapse began with Brad. My father thought he was marrying Chloe off to a brilliant entrepreneur. In reality, Brad was a gambler in a suit. He convinced my father to take out a second mortgage on the house to fund his tech incubator. He promised a 10 times return within a year. Instead, he burned through $200,000 in 6 months on office furniture business lunches and a cryptocurrency scam that went to zero overnight. Then there was Chloe. My sister treats credit limits like suggestions. She needed a $50,000 gender reveal party with a live elephant. She needed a nursery designed by a celebrity stylist from Los Angeles. My parents, desperate to maintain the image of the perfect, wealthy family, kept signing the checks. They stopped paying the mortgage to pay for the parties. They stopped paying the property taxes to pay for the lease on the Range Rover. They were robbing Peter to pay Paul, but eventually Paul stopped taking their calls. By the time the bank flagged the loan as a non-performing asset, the house was underwater. To the bank, the Thomas estate was just a toxic liability on a spreadsheet. They wanted it gone. They were preparing to bundle it and sell it off to a collection agency. That is when I made my move. I didn't walk in as Naya the daughter. I walked in as NJ Holdings, a faceless private equity firm with liquidity. I remember the meeting with the bank vice president. He looked tired. He told me the homeowners were difficult and delusional. I told him I specialized in difficult. I offered to buy the debt for 40 cents on the dollar. A massive discount. In a normal market, he would have laughed me out of the room. But this was a bad debt that had been dragging down his quarterly numbers. He didn't even negotiate. He just wanted the headache to be someone else's problem. I sat in that sterile conference room and watched him slide the paperwork across the mahogany table. The pen felt heavy in my hand, cool and solid. With one signature, I wasn't just buying a building. I was buying the leverage to finally make them see me. I signed my name right next to the line that declared the borrower in default. It cost me a fraction of what the house was worth, but the emotional payoff was priceless. My parents thought they were living in their own kingdom, But for the last 3 weeks, they had been living in my investment property. And the best part was that I used the profits from my other deals to buy it. The money I made because they forced me to be independent was now the only thing keeping a roof over their heads, or in this case, taking it away. The silence of my penthouse office was broken by the aggressive buzzing of my phone against the black marble desk. It was buzzing so hard, it was actually moving across the smooth surface. I glanced at the screen. It was Chloe. Of course it was. My sister had never fought a battle she couldn't win by crying to Daddy, so her first instinct was to attack the person threatening her bubble. I picked up the phone and unlocked it. The messages were coming in so fast they were overlapping. "You are sick, Nia," the first one read. "Dad is calling his lawyer right now. We know you faked those papers. You are just jealous because I am pregnant and happy and you are alone. You need mental help." I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a laugh that echoed off the glass walls. It was pathetic. Chloe was so deluded by her own privilege that she actually believed I would risk jail time to forge a bank document. In her world, bad things didn't happen to the Thomas family. Therefore, if a bad thing was happening, it must be a lie. She thought this was a prank. She thought I was acting out like a child. She had no idea she was talking to the new owner of her bedroom. I didn't type a reply. I didn't engage in her name-calling. I learned a long time ago that you do not argue with a narcissist. You show them the mirror. I opened the secure portal for the National Mortgage Registry on my center monitor. I typed in my parents' address. The screen loaded instantly, displaying the property details. There it was, in bold black letters. Status sold. Current lien holder. NJ Holdings LLC. Outstanding balance to First National Bank, $0. I took a screenshot of the official record. I used the editing tool to circle the date of the sale and the name of my company in bright red ink. Then I switched back to the text thread with Chloe. She was still typing, probably sending another paragraph about how ungrateful I was. I interrupted her monologue by sending the image. The text bubble with the 3 dots appeared immediately. She was typing. Then the dots disappeared. Then they appeared again. Then they disappeared for good. I imagined her standing in the foyer of that big house holding her phone, showing the screen to Brad and Dad. I imagined the blood draining from their faces as they realized this was not a print shop forgery. This was a federally recorded transfer of assets. The house was gone. I decided to send one follow-up text just to make sure the message landed. I typed slowly. "It is not fake, Chloe. It is public record. And since you mentioned lawyers tell Dad to save his money, he is going to need it for a moving truck. By the way, since NJ Holdings now owns the property, I will be sending over a lease agreement tomorrow morning. Rent is $8,000 a month plus a security deposit. I suggest you start packing." I hit send and watched the message turn from delivered to read. She didn't reply. Finally, silence. The next morning, I sat in the corner office of Julian Vance, the only man in Atlanta I trusted with my life and my money. Julian was not just a lawyer. He was a shark in a 3-piece suit. We had closed 50 deals together, buying up dilapidated apartment complexes and turning them into gold mines. But today, the file sitting on his mahogany desk was different. It wasn't a commercial property. It was personal. Julian took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired. He tapped the folder with his index finger and looked at me with genuine concern. "Nia," he said, his voice low and serious. "I have reviewed the paperwork for the Thomas estate. The acquisition is watertight. Legally, you own the deed free and clear. NJ Holdings is the undeniable landlord, but we need to talk about the optics." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city. "Evicting strangers is business. Evicting your own parents, especially when your father is Bishop Thomas, is war. He is going to drag you through the mud, Nia. He will use the church. He will use the press. He will paint you as the ungrateful daughter who stole the roof over his head. Are you ready for that kind of heat?" I didn't blink. I crossed my legs and smoothed the fabric of my silk trousers. "Julian," I said, "my father has been dragging me through the mud since I was 5 years old. The only difference is that now I own the mud. I want you to file the unlawful detainer action immediately. I want the sheriff involved. I want the official notice posted on the front door where all the neighbors can see it. Julian turned back to face me. He leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. We could offer them a settlement, Nia. We could give them 30 days to vacate quietly. We could offer them a small cash for keys deal to avoid the embarrassment. It would be faster and it would keep your name out of the tabloids. I shook my head slowly. No, absolutely not. If I give them 30 days, they will spend 29 of them trying to manipulate me and the last one stealing the copper wiring out of the walls. They do not respect generosity, Julian. They only respect force. I want you to execute the eviction with the maximum prejudice allowed by the law. I want every deadline to be rigid. I want every violation documented. I stood up and walked over to him, looking him dead in the eye. When they threw me out, I had a backpack and $50. I slept in my car for 3 weeks. They didn't offer me a settlement. They didn't give me 30 days. They gave me trauma. So no, Julian, I do not want to be nice. I want to be thorough. Julian studied my face for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation. When he didn't find any, he nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. He sat back down and opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. All right then. We do it your way. I will have the papers filed by noon. We are going to make this very difficult for them. I picked up my purse and headed for the door. Not just difficult, Julian, I said, looking back over my shoulder. Make it painful. I want them to feel exactly as helpless as I did. And send the bill to my personal account. I do not care what it costs. Just make sure that when the gavel bangs, they have nowhere left to hide. Sunday morning at Greater Hope Cathedral was not just a religious service. It was a fashion show and a status update for the black elite of Atlanta. The parking lot was filled with luxury sedans, and the air inside the sanctuary smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the mahogany pews where 600 people sat fanning themselves, waiting for the word. At the center of it all stood my father, Bishop Thomas. He gripped the wooden pulpit with both hands, his knuckles white. To the congregation, he looked like a pillar of strength in his purple and gold vestments. But from where I sat in the third row, wearing oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, I could see the beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. He looked like a man running out of time. He cleared his throat, and the entire room went silent. He didn't open his Bible immediately. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on me before moving on. Brothers and sisters. He began, his voice booming with that charismatic baritone that had built this church. Today, I want to talk to you about betrayal. I want to talk about the serpent in the garden. We live in a time where loyalty is rare. We raise our children. We sacrifice for them. We give them the clothes on their backs and the food on their tables. And how do they repay us? A chorus of amens rippled through the crowd. My mother, Evelyn, was sitting in the front pew, nodding vigorously. She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the suffering saint to perfection. Beside her, Chloe sat with her hand on her stomach, looking like the Virgin Mary herself. They were putting on a master class in manipulation. My father continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity. The scripture tells us about the prodigal son, but at least the prodigal son had the decency to leave. What do we do with the child who stays only to poison the well? What do we do with the child who bites the hand that fed her? I tell you today that the devil does not always come with horns. Sometimes he comes with a contract. Sometimes he comes with envy. There are those who seek to tear down the house of the righteous because they cannot build their own. The congregation turned their heads. I could feel their eyes on me. They knew the rumors. My family had been busy spinning the narrative all weekend. They told everyone I was mentally unstable. They told everyone I was on drugs. They told everyone I was trying to steal their home out of spite. I sat there perfectly still. My face was a mask of indifference. I watched my father use the pulpit to bully me publicly, just like he used the dinner table to bully me privately. He was weaponizing God to cover his bad credit score. He spoke of honor and duty while knowing that he had stolen from the church building fund to pay his gambling debts. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. He thought shaming me would make me back down. He thought using the pressure of the community would break me. But he forgot one thing. I wasn't the little girl who needed the church's approval anymore. I was the woman who owned the mortgage on the parsonage he was sleeping in, and I was about to make an offering he could not refuse. When the offering baskets began to circulate, I didn't reach for my purse to pull out a crumpled $5 bill. I stood up. The movement was so sudden and graceful that it drew every eye in the sanctuary away from the pulpit and onto me. I smoothed down the front of my designer dress and began to walk toward the altar. In the Baptist tradition, walking to the front during the offering usually meant you were making a significant sacrifice. The organist, seeing me approach, faltered for a beat before finding his rhythm again. My father, Bishop Thomas, stopped wiping his brow. He looked down at me from his elevated platform with a mixture of confusion and dread. He was expecting a scene. He was expecting me to scream. He was not expecting me to smile. I reached the front row where the head deacon, Mr. Jones, was holding the large gold collection plate. Deacon Jones was a good man, but he was also the man constantly stressing about the church's finances. I knew for a fact that the cathedral roof had a leak that was destroying the drywall in the choir loft because I had seen the repair estimates on my father's desk before I evicted him. Estimates he ignored to pay for his gambling debts. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a check. It wasn't folded. It was crisp and flat. I held it between my index and middle finger like a playing card. I stepped up to Deacon Jones and dropped the check into the plate. It fluttered down in slow motion, landing face up on top of a pile of small bills. The silence in the room was deafening. I leaned in close to the microphone on the stand next to the deacon, just close enough that my whisper carried through the sound system. "For the roof repair. Deacon," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I know how much my father hates a broken home." Deacon Jones looked down at the check. His eyes bulged behind his thick glasses. He picked it up, his hands trembling. He looked at the number, $50,000. He looked at the signature. Nia Thomas. Then he looked at my father. "Glory to God!" Deacon Jones shouted, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "The Lord has provided. We can fix the roof. Hallelujah." The congregation erupted. They didn't know the backstory. They only knew that the bishop's daughter, the so-called prodigal son, had just saved the building. People jumped to their feet, clapping and praising God. My mother sat in the front row, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She couldn't criticize me now. I was the biggest donor in the room. I looked up at my father. He was gripping the pulpit so hard I thought the wood might splinter. He was trapped. He couldn't refuse the money without looking insane, and he couldn't accept it without acknowledging my power. He was completely isolated on his stage, surrounded by people cheering for the very person he had just tried to destroy. I gave him a small nod, a little salute to his hypocrisy, and turned around. I walked back down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I didn't just win the argument, I bought the argument. And as I walked out into the sunlight, I knew that was the best $50,000 I had ever spent. The service ended, and while the rest of the congregation headed to the fellowship hall for fried chicken and gossip, my mother Evelyn had a different destination. She marched out to the parking lot, her heels clicking angrily on the asphalt, and slid into her pearl-white Mercedes. She didn't go home to comfort my father. She punched an address into her GPS. It was the address of the crumbling apartment complex on the south side where I had lived when I was 22. The last address she had for me. The place she assumed I was still rotting in. She drove out of the manicured suburbs and into the city, the scenery changing from green lawns to concrete and graffiti. I can only imagine what was going through her mind. She was probably rehearsing her speech. She was going to catch me. She was convinced that the $50,000 check was fake, or worse, that it was stolen money. She wanted to find me in a squalid little room surrounded by illegal drugs or a criminal boyfriend so she could drag me back to the bishop and say, "Look, Thomas, I told you she was no good." She needed me to be a failure so she could remain the saint. She pulled up to the curb of the darker complex, a place where the streetlights didn't work and the sidewalks were cracked. A group of young men sitting on the stoop stared at her luxury car with predatory interest. Evelyn locked her doors and hurried toward apartment 4B, clutching her designer purse to her chest like a shield. She climbed the graffiti-stained stairs, holding her breath against the smell of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. When she reached the door, she didn't knock politely. She pounded on the peeling wood with her fist. "Nia, open this door right now. I know you are in there." The door swung open, but it wasn't me standing there. It was a large man with tattoos covering his neck and a pit bull standing by his leg. He looked down at my mother, his face twisted in annoyance. "Who are you and why are you banging on my door, lady?" My mother took a step back, her confidence faltering. "I am looking for my daughter, Nia Thomas. She lives here. Tell her to come out." The man laughed, a rough barking sound. "Nia. The girl who used to live here. Lady, you are way off. Nia hasn't lived here in 3 years. She moved uptown." My mother froze. 3 years. But that is impossible. She works at a thrift store. She can't afford to move. The man shook his head, preparing to close the door. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. When she moved out, she had movers, professional ones, and she was driving a better car than the one you parked outside. Now get off my porch before I call the cops." The door slammed shut in her face. Evelyn stood there in the dim hallway, the silence pressing in on her. For the first time, fear began to replace her anger. If I wasn't living in poverty, where was I? If I wasn't struggling, how did I get the money? She walked slowly back to her car, her legs feeling heavy. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she didn't know her own daughter. She was fighting a stranger. And as she sat in her car watching the neighborhood she realized she had no leverage left. The narrative she had built about poor, helpless Nia was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else about her perfect life was about to crumble? My phone lit up on the black marble desk, vibrating against the cold stone. The screen displayed a photo of my mother Evelyn wearing her Sunday church hat and a fake smile. I swiped accept and put it on speaker, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair with a glass of sparkling water in my hand. On the other end, the connection crackled with the sound of city traffic and heavy panicked breathing. Evelyn didn't say hello. She launched straight into an interrogation, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "I am standing outside that rat-hole apartment complex on 4th Street, she hissed. "That man said you moved. He said you have money. He said you had professional movers. Tell me the truth right now, Nia. Who are you sleeping with?" I laughed. It was a genuine dark laugh that bubbled up from my chest. Of course. In Evelyn's world, a black woman could not possibly make millions through intellect, strategy, or hard work. It had to be sin. It had to be dirty. If I had money, it meant I had sold my soul or my body. "I am not sleeping with anyone, Mother," I replied calmly, watching the stock ticker scroll across my computer screen. "I am sleeping in a penthouse that I own." It is amazing what you can afford when you are not funding Brad's gambling addiction or Chloe's designer handbag collection. "Do not lie to me," she screamed. I could hear the desperation clawing at her throat. "You dropped $50,000 in the collection plate like it was pocket change. You bought our mortgage note. Where did it come from? Is it drugs? Are you laundering money for a gang? I swear to God, Nia, if the police come to my door looking for you, I will hand you over myself. I will not let you drag this family down with your criminal lifestyle just because you wanted a shortcut to wealth." She was projecting so hard it was almost impressive. She was the one living in a house bought with predatory loans and unpaid bills. Yet in her mind, I was the criminal. She would rather believe I was a drug dealer than accept I was a success. "You really have a low opinion of me, don't you?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave to a professional chilly tone. "You think the only way I could be worth more than you is if I broke the law. But here is the reality, Evelyn. I am a businesswoman. And as a businesswoman, I audit my assets. Right now, I am looking at the utility bills for the property at 15 Oak Creek Drive. My property. Don't change the subject, she yelled. I want to know who gave you that check. I am not changing the subject, I said, staring at the overdue notice on my monitor. I am giving you a courtesy notification. Since the utility account is now legally in my name as the property owner, and I noticed the gas bill hasn't been paid in 3 months, I decided to mitigate my risk. I called the gas company 5 minutes ago and canceled the service. I wouldn't want to be liable for a leak in a house occupied by squatters. What her voice went from angry to terrified in a split second. You can't do that. I have a standing rib roast in the oven. The Deacons are coming for Sunday dinner in 2 hours. You cannot cut the gas, Nia. It is 40 degrees outside. Well, I said, taking a cool sip of my water. I hope they like sushi, because that stove is going to be cold in about 15 minutes. Maybe you can ask Chloe to breathe on the food to warm it up. She is full of hot air, isn't she? Nia, you are evil, she shrieked. You are the devil. No, Mother, I said, reaching for the button to end the call. I am just fiscally responsible. Have a blessed Sunday. I tapped the red icon and watched the line go dead. I didn't hate them. I just wanted them to understand that gravity works both ways. And they had been looking down on me for far too long. Now they were about to freeze in the shadow I cast. Monday morning arrived with the ruthless efficiency I admired. While my family was likely boiling water on a camping stove to make instant coffee, I was watching the sunrise from my treadmill, reviewing the quarterly earnings of a logistics company I planned to acquire. My world was orderly, theirs was chaos. And just as I stepped off the machine to grab a towel, the chaos tried to infiltrate my peace again. My personal cell phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the caller ID display made me pause. It was registered to a burner phone app. I swiped to answer but didn't speak. I let the silence hang there, forcing the caller to reveal themselves first. Nia, a male voice whispered. It was low, hurried, and sounded like it was coming from inside a closet. Please do not hang up. It is Brad. I rolled my eyes so hard it almost hurt. Brad. My brother-in-law. The man who had put his feet on my chair less than 48 hours ago. The man who looked at me like I was a cockroach while sipping my father's wine. Now he was whispering my name like a conspirator. I am listening, I said, my voice flat. You have 30 seconds before I block this number too. Wait, he said, the desperation leaking through the phone. Look, I know things got heated on Thursday. I know what Evelyn said was terrible. I just wanted to reach out privately, man to man. Well, you know what I mean. I wanted to say that I never agreed with how they treated you. I was just trying to keep the peace for Chloe's sake. Pregnant hormones, you know. She is out of control. I walked over to the window, looking down at the city traffic. This was fascinating. The ship was sinking, the water was rising, and the rats were already turning on each other. Brad wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling because he had done the math. He realized the Thomas family bank was closed, and he was looking for a new host to latch onto. You are calling me from a burner app to tell me my sister is hormonal? I asked. That is very brave of you, Brad. Does Chloe know you are making this call? Of course not, he scoffed, his tone shifting from desperate to conspiratorial. Chloe doesn't understand business. She thinks with her emotions. But you and I, Nia, we are different. We are entrepreneurs. I did some research on NJ Holdings over the weekend. I am impressed. Seriously. You have built an empire. And it got me thinking. You need someone on the inside. Someone who can help manage the transition with your parents. Someone reasonable. I suppressed a smile. He was offering to be a double agent. He was offering to sell out his pregnant wife and his in-laws for a chance to get on my good side. It was disgusting, but it was also useful. I am listening, I said again, letting a sliver of interest creep into my voice. I have a business proposition, Brad said, his voice gaining confidence. And maybe a personal one. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Let me buy you lunch. Today, just us. No Chloe, no parents. I can explain everything and I think I can help you get what you really want. I checked my calendar. I had a free hour at noon. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was going to try to charm me. He was going to try to leverage his position to get the house back, or maybe even ask for a loan. He thought I was just a woman with money who needed a man's validation. He had no idea he was walking into a lion's den. Fine, I said. Meet me at Le Jardin at 12 sharp. If you are 1 minute late, the offer is rescinded. And Brad, if you tell Chloe, the deal is off. I hung up before he could answer. I stood there for a moment looking at the black screen of my phone. Betrayal is an ugly thing, but watching a traitor trap himself is a beautiful spectator sport. I went to my closet to pick out an outfit. I needed something sharp, something that said, I am not your sister, and I am certainly not your savior. Brad wanted a private meeting. I would give him one, and I would make sure every single word he said was recorded for posterity. I arrived at Le Jardin 5 minutes early and selected a corner booth that offered privacy but excellent acoustics. I placed my phone face down on the white tablecloth with the voice memo app already running. The camera angle of my life was fixed on the empty chair opposite me, waiting for the traitor to arrive. At 12 o'clock sharp, Brad walked in. He had traded his usual arrogant swagger for a look of practiced humility, but I could see the greed behind his eyes. He sat down and ordered a double scotch without asking if I wanted anything. You look expensive, Nia, Brad said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. I mean that as a compliment. You have changed. You are not the scared little girl hiding in the library anymore. You are a player. I respect that. I took a slow sip of my iced tea and stared at him. Cut to the chase, Brad. You said you had a business proposition. I have a meeting in 45 minutes and I charge $1,000 an hour for consulting. Brad laughed nervously and took a large gulp of his drink. Right. Business. Look. Nia, let us be honest. Your parents are a sinking ship. Bishop Thomas is a dinosaur and Evelyn is delusional. They are dragging everyone down with them, including me. Including Chloe. He paused, looking around to make sure no one was listening, then he lowered his voice. Chloe is a mess, Nia. She is spoiled, she is demanding, and frankly, she is not half the woman you are. I realized something this weekend. I married the wrong sister. I thought I was marrying into a dynasty, but I married into a liability. You are the one with the real power. You are the one with the assets. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, but I kept my face impassive. I needed him to say it clearly. I needed it on the record. So you are saying you are unhappy with my sister? Unhappy is an understatement, Brad sneered. I am trapped. But I see a way out. A partnership. Between us. Here is my offer. I know where Bishop Thomas hides his remaining cash. I know about the offshore accounts he thinks are secret. I can help you find every last dime he has. I can help you destroy them completely. And what do you want in exchange? I asked, leaning in slightly to ensure the microphone caught every syllable. Brad reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His palm was sweaty. I want immunity. I want you to forgive the debt on the house so I do not have a bankruptcy on my record. And I want a fresh start. With you. I will leave Chloe. I will file for divorce tomorrow. She can keep the baby and the debt. I want to be on the winning team, Nia. I want to be with the owner, not the squatter. I looked down at his hand covering mine, then back up at his face. The audacity was breathtaking. He was willing to abandon his pregnant wife and his unborn child, just to save his credit score and chase my money. He was a parasite looking for a new host. I slowly pulled my hand away from his grip. That is a very interesting offer, Brad. I said, my voice cool and even. You would really leave your pregnant wife for me just because I hold the mortgage? In a heartbeat, Brad said with zero hesitation, just say the word. I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. I smiled a genuine sharp smile that didn't reach my eyes. Thank you, Brad. That was exactly what I needed to hear. I stood up and threw a $20 bill on the table. Enjoy your scotch. I have to go prepare for a foreclosure. And Brad, you might want to call a divorce lawyer anyway. Because when Chloe hears this recording, she is going to eat you alive. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting there with his mouth open, realizing too late that he hadn't been negotiating a deal. He had been digging his own grave. The sun had set over Atlanta, leaving the sky a bruised purple and black. Inside my penthouse, the lights were dim and the jazz was soft. But across town at 15 Oak Creek Drive, the chandeliers were blazing. My monitors showed a spike in energy usage. They were running the dryer, the dishwasher, the jacuzzi tub, and every television in the house. They were living as if nothing had changed. They were ignoring the lease agreement I had emailed. They were ignoring the eviction notice posted on the door. They thought if they just kept pretending to be rich, the reality of their poverty would politely go away. I picked up my tablet and opened the smart home control app. One of the upgrades my father had insisted on installing last year was a fully integrated home automation system. He wanted to be able to control the climate and lighting from his phone to impress his golf buddies. The irony was that when I bought the deed, I also bought the administrator rights to the system. I was now the master user. They were just guests. Unwanted, non-paying guests. I took a sip of wine and tapped the icon labeled Main Breaker. On the screen, the status changed from on to off. In my mind, I could see exactly what was happening. 1 second, the house was a beacon of warmth and light. The next second, it was a tomb. The sudden darkness would be absolute. No streetlights reached that far back on the property. I watched the real-time data feed. The energy consumption dropped to 0 instantly. The jacuzzi pump stopped. The sub-zero refrigerator hummed into silence. The heating system, which was fighting the 40-degree chill outside, groaned and died. My phone rang almost immediately. It was my mother. I declined the call. Then my father called. Declined. Then Chloe. Declined. They were probably stumbling around in the dark, banging their shins on the expensive furniture they hadn't paid for. I could imagine the panic. My mother was terrified of the dark, a fear she never grew out of. My father was likely cursing, trying to find a flashlight that actually had batteries. But the worst part for them wouldn't be the darkness. It would be the silence. Without the hum of the HVAC, without the noise of the TV, without the distraction of their devices which would soon run out of battery, they would have to sit in the quiet. They would have to sit in the cold and listen to each other breathe. I sent a single group text to all of them. Rent was due yesterday. Since no payment was received and no lease was signed, all non-essential services have been suspended. The security system is also disabled. I suggest you lock the doors manually. Sleep tight. I set my phone down. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about physics. Friction generates heat. Pressure bursts pipes. I was applying pressure. I was stripping away every layer of comfort until they were naked and shivering. They wanted to live in a house they didn't own. Fine. They could live in it. But they were about to learn that a mansion without power is just a very large, very cold cave. And in the dark, the monsters you are hiding from tend to come out. The next morning, the peace of my office was shattered not by a phone call, but by an urgent notification from my publicist. It simply said, "Do not look at Instagram." Naturally, I opened the app immediately. What I saw made my blood run cold, not out of fear, but out of sheer amazement at the audacity. Chloe was live. The viewer count was climbing past 10,000. She was sitting in the living room of the mansion, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The room was pitch black save for a single flickering candle she had placed strategically near her face to catch the reflection of her tears. It was a masterclass in lighting and stagecraft. She looked frail. She looked terrified. She looked like a refugee in her own home. "Hey guys," she whispered into the camera, her voice trembling with a practiced vulnerability. "I know I haven't posted in a while. I didn't want to bring this negativity here, but we are scared. Last night my sister Nia cut off our power. She bought our house out from under us, and now she is trying to freeze us out. I am 6 months pregnant, and I am sitting here in the dark, shivering, because my sister cares more about money than she cares about her own family. She wiped a perfectly timed tear away and sniffled loudly. It is just so hard, you know. We tried to love her. We tried to help her. But she has become this monster. She has all these millions, and she won't even let our dad, the bishop, keep the lights on. She wants us on the street. Please pray for us. And please share this. People need to know the truth about NJ Holdings. I watched the comments roll in like a tidal wave of sewage. They were vicious. She is a demon. Boycott her business. How can someone be so heartless to a pregnant woman? Let's find out where she lives. The internet mob had arrived. They bought it hook, line, and sinker. Chloe had weaponized her incompetence and turned it into victimhood. She didn't mention the unpaid mortgage. She didn't mention the years of emotional abuse. She didn't mention that she had a capable husband who could get a job to pay the electric bill. She just painted a picture of a Cinderella story gone wrong, where the wicked stepsister wins. For a moment, I felt a flicker of panic. In my line of work, reputation is currency. If this narrative took hold, it could damage my deal flow. Investors do not like drama. But then I looked closer at the screen. I zoomed in on the video. I looked at the blanket she was wrapped in. It was Hermes, a $2,000 cashmere blanket, and the candle she was burning to signify her poverty was a diptyque scent that cost $80. Even in her performance of destitution, she couldn't help but be expensive. I didn't report the video. I didn't comment to defend myself. I simply hit the record button and captured the entire performance. Chloe thought she was winning the court of public opinion. She didn't realize that in a court of law, every lie she told was evidence. She claimed she was helpless. I was about to prove she was a liar. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian. "Get the defamation suit ready," I said. "And download that video before she deletes it. She just gave us everything we need to bury them." The internet mob was still raging outside, but inside my office the only sound was the rustling of old paper. I had turned off the screens. I was done with the digital noise. I needed to go back to the source. I had the original banker's box containing the physical mortgage files delivered to my penthouse earlier that evening. It smelled like dust and secrets. I was looking for financial indiscretions, perhaps a hidden bank account, or a fraudulent tax return I could use as leverage to silence Chloe. I was hunting for numbers. I found something far more dangerous. Buried at the bottom of the stack, stuck between a property survey and a termite inspection report, was a folder labeled Life Insurance Collateral. It was standard procedure. When you take out a loan of that size, the bank often requires a life insurance policy to secure the debt. My father, being the prudent man he pretended to be, had taken out a $2 million policy 25 years ago. To get approved for that amount, both he and my mother had to undergo mandatory medical screenings. I pulled out the yellowing document. It was a lab report from 1998. It listed their vitals, their cholesterol levels, and their blood types. I ran my finger down the column for Bishop Thomas. Blood type O negative. I moved my finger to Evelyn Thomas. Blood type O positive. I froze. The room suddenly felt very cold. I sat back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I closed my eyes and went back to the hospital room from 5 years ago. The night of my car accident. I remembered the nurse hanging the blood bag. I remembered the red letters on the plastic tag. A B positive. The doctor had told me I was a universal recipient. I could take blood from anyone. I opened my eyes and looked at the paper again. I did the math. It was high school biology. Punnett squares. If my father was type O and my mother was type O, they carried only recessive genes. They could only produce a child with type O blood. It was genetically impossible for two type O parents to produce a type A/B child. It wasn't just unlikely. It was impossible. I stood up and walked to the window, the city lights blurring before my eyes. For 29 years, I had wondered why I was the black sheep. I wondered why I was darker than Chloe. why I was taller, why my hair texture was different, why they looked at me with disgust while they looked at Chloe with adoration. I always thought it was just favoritism. I thought I just wasn't good enough. But it wasn't about behavior. It was about biology. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just the disappointment of the family. I wasn't part of the family at all. Or if I was, one of them was lying. One of them had a secret so big it had poisoned my entire existence. I looked back at the document on my desk. It wasn't just a medical record anymore. It was a confession. I wasn't a Thomas. And that meant the people I had been trying to please, the people I was now destroying, were strangers. The game had just changed completely. I wasn't fighting my parents. I was fighting my kidnappers. I sat in the corner booth of a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from the prying eyes of the congregation and the gossip circles of the country club. Across from me sat Marcus, a private investigator, who had helped me vet potential business partners for years. He was the best in the business because he didn't ask moral questions. He only asked for the check. Today, however, the look on his face wasn't professional detachment. It was confusion. I slid the yellowing life insurance document across the Formica table. Marcus picked it up, his eyes scanning the data columns. He looked at the parents' blood types. Then he looked at the recent lab report I had printed from my own physical last month. O positive and O negative, Marcus muttered, rubbing his chin. And you are a B. He looked up at me, his voice low. Nia, you know the science. This is impossible. Biologically, these two people cannot produce a child with your blood type. It is genetically 0% probable. I nodded, sipping my black coffee. I know. That is why I am here. For 29 years, they treated me like I was a curse. They treated Chloe like she was the second coming of Christ. I always thought it was because they just didn't like me. But now I think it is because they knew I wasn't theirs. Or, I paused, leaning in closer. Or that document is a lie. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? My father is a con artist, Marcus. I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. He lies about his income. He lies about his taxes. He lies about his faith. Why wouldn't he lie about his medical history to get a better insurance rate? Maybe that paper is fake. Maybe I am his biological daughter and he has been gaslighting me my whole life to make me feel like an outsider so I wouldn't ask for my share of the estate. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small sealed plastic bag. Inside was a silver hairbrush. I took this from Chloe's bathroom vanity before I locked the house, I said. It is full of her hair strands. I want you to run a full DNA panel. Marcus took the bag carefully. You want to see if she matches the parents. I want to see if she matches me. I corrected him. If we are sisters, full sisters, then the blood type document is definitely a fake, and my parents are just cruel. But if we don't match, if I am not related to her and she matches them, then I was stolen, or adopted, or bought. I took a deep breath. But I have another theory, Marcus. A gut feeling. What if I am the only biological child? What if I am the one who actually shares their blood, and that is why they hate me, because I remind them of their sins? And Chloe, the perfect light-skinned angelic Chloe, what if she is the one they picked out of a catalog to be the perfect accessory? Marcus put the bag in his pocket and stood up. I will rush this to the lab. 24 hours, Nia. We will know the truth. I watched him walk out of the diner. I was playing a dangerous game. I was asking a question that could erase my entire identity, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to know if I was a Thomas or if I was just a victim of a 30-year-long kidnapping. And more importantly, I needed to know if Chloe was my sister or just another one of their assets. 24 hours later, Marcus sat in my office again. The city skyline outside was shrouded in fog, reflecting my state of mind. He didn't ask for coffee this time. He didn't make small talk. He placed a single white envelope on the black marble desk and slid it toward me with 2 fingers. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a bomb disposal technician handing over a live explosive. I looked at the envelope. It contained the genetic map of the Thomas family. It held the answer to why I was the outcast and why Chloe was the princess. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the letter opener. The sound of the paper slicing open was the loudest thing in the room. I pulled out the trifold document. It was from a genetic testing laboratory in Atlanta, heavily stamped with confidentiality notices. I skipped the preamble and went straight to the data tables. Marcus had been thorough. He had managed to run a comparative analysis using the hair from Chloe's brush and a sample I had provided from my father's razor, which I had confiscated during the eviction process. I first looked at the column labeled Sample A Nia Thomas and Sample B Bishop Thomas. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I was his daughter. I was a Thomas. The blood running through my veins was the same blood that ran through the man who had rejected me. I wasn't adopted. I wasn't an accident. I was the legitimate heir. The biology in the insurance paper from 1998 had been a lie or a clerical error, but the DNA didn't lie. I was his flesh and blood. Then I moved my eyes to the second table. Sample C, Chloe Thomas, and Sample B, Bishop Thomas. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, thinking the stress was making me hallucinate. The numbers didn't change. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Excluded. I stared at the zero. It was a perfect hollow circle. I looked up at Marcus. He nodded solemnly, confirming what I was reading. She is not his daughter, Nia, Marcus said, his voice quiet. She shares a maternal link with you, so Evelyn is definitely her mother. But the bishop is not her father. Chloe is the product of an extramarital affair. I sat back in my chair and the laughter started. It wasn't happy laughter. It was the manic, hysterical laughter of someone watching the world burn down. It all made sense. The favoritism. The way my mother doted on Chloe. She wasn't protecting Chloe because she was better. She was protecting Chloe because she was a secret. Chloe was the living, breathing proof of my mother's infidelity. And my father, the great moral leader, the man who preached about the sanctity of marriage, had spent 26 years raising another man's child while treating his own biological daughter like trash. I looked at the paper again. This wasn't just a test result, this was a nuclear warhead. My mother had convinced the bishop that I was the disappointment because I reminded her of him. She hated me because I looked like the husband she cheated on. And she loved Chloe because Chloe was the child of the man she actually wanted. I folded the paper slowly and placed it back in the envelope. The shaking in my hands had stopped. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They wanted to talk about family values. They wanted to talk about heritage and legacy. Well, I had the receipts. I wasn't just going to evict them from the house. I was about to evict them from their own reality. I looked at Marcus and smiled. You can send the bill. I have everything I need to end this. I sat there clutching the DNA results, expecting to feel triumphant. I thought I held the weapon that would finally break Bishop Thomas. But as I stared at the 0% probability, a darker realization washed over me. I was looking at this like a daughter seeking love, but I needed to look at it like a predator analyzing prey. My father was not a stupid man. He was a man who built a mega-church empire on charisma and calculation. There was no way he didn't know. My mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday in 1999. I was 12 years old. It played out in my memory like an old grainy film reel. I had just won the state math Olympiad. I walked into his study holding a gold trophy that was half the size of my body. I was so proud. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to say that I was smart, that I was worthy. He was sitting in his leather chair holding Chloe, who was 3 years old. Chloe hadn't done anything. She was just sitting there wearing a frilly pink dress, playing with his expensive fountain pen. When I showed him the trophy, he didn't smile. He looked at me with a cold, distant irritation. Put it on the shelf, Nia, he had said without even looking at the inscription. Then he turned back to Chloe and kissed her forehead, calling her his little angel, his perfect miracle. For years, I thought that moment was about me not being good enough. But now, looking at the genetics report, I finally understood the twisted logic of Bishop Thomas. He knew Chloe wasn't his. He had to know. A man as arrogant as him doesn't miss the fact that his second daughter has hazel eyes and sandy hair when both parents are dark. He didn't need a lab test. He knew my mother had stepped out on him. But instead of exposing her, he made a deal with the devil. He chose to love the lie because the lie made him look good. Chloe was the perfect prop. She was the beautiful, light-skinned cherub that the congregation adored. She fit the image of the blessed family he was selling on Sunday mornings. And me. I was the biological child. I was the one who actually carried his DNA. I had his nose. I had his stubborn jawline. I had his dark ambition. And that is exactly why he hated me. I was the mirror. Every time he looked at me, he saw himself, and he saw the reality of his marriage. I was the witness to his humiliation. I was the tangible proof that he was just a man, not a god. He loved the bastard child because she allowed him to play the role of the benevolent father. He hated his own flesh and blood because I demanded to be real. He wasn't a victim of my mother's affair. He was an accomplice. He traded his dignity for a pretty family portrait. He accepted a counterfeit daughter to save his ego, and he sacrificed his real daughter to keep the secret. He let me believe I was broken, so he wouldn't have to admit he was a cuckold. I stood up and walked to the shredder. I didn't need to show him this paper. Showing him would only give him a chance to deny it or make excuses. I realized that exposing the secret wasn't enough. I had to destroy the stage he was acting on. He loved the image of perfection more than he loved the truth. So I wasn't just going to take his house, I was going to take his audience. I was going to take the only thing he actually cared about. His reputation. The city of Atlanta was glowing with red and green lights blinking in the rhythm of the holiday spirit. From my balcony 45 floors up, it looked like a fairyland. But I was not looking for magic. I was looking for closure. It was Christmas Eve. In a normal family, this would be a night of hot cocoa and matching pajamas. But the Thomas family did not do normal. Tonight they were hosting their annual Christmas Eve gala. It was the biggest social event of the season. Senators would be there. Megachurch pastors would be there. The entire social register of the black elite would be sipping champagne in the living room that I legally owned. They had ignored my eviction notices. They had ignored the power outage by renting massive industrial generators, which were currently roaring in the backyard, probably annoying the neighbors. They were betting on the fact that I wouldn't cause a scene on Christmas Eve. They were betting that I still had a shred of daughterly duty left in my heart. They were wrong. I didn't have duty left. I had a writ of possession and a DNA test that proved their entire dynasty was a lie. I walked into my closet, which was larger than the first apartment I rented after they kicked me out. I needed armor for what I was about to do. I bypassed the reds and greens. I wasn't going to a party to celebrate. I was going to a funeral. I chose a dress that was blacker than a moonless night. It was structured silk, sharp at the shoulders, and fitted through the waist with a neckline that plunged just enough to be dangerous. It was a dress that said, "I am not here to negotiate, I am here to conquer." I sat at my vanity and applied my makeup with the precision of a surgeon. Sharp winged eyeliner, deep crimson lipstick. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek bun. I fastened a diamond choker around my neck. It felt cold and heavy like the truth I was carrying. I looked at myself in the mirror. The girl who used to beg for their approval was gone. Staring back at me was a woman who had built herself from the scraps they threw away. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved for emergencies. It rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered. "Sheriff Miller speaking." "Sheriff, this is Nia Thomas from NJ Holdings." I said, my voice steady. "Ms. Thomas, I assume this is about the property on Oak Creek Drive. We received the judge's order this morning. Usually we don't execute evictions on holidays. It is bad optics. I know, Sheriff. But this is a special case. The occupants are currently hosting a commercial event on the property without the owner's consent. They are charging entry fees for a charity that does not exist. They are damaging the asset. And more importantly, I have reason to believe they are liquidating fixtures that belong to the estate. I need you to enforce the writ immediately. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear the sheriff shifting in his chair. He knew my father. Everyone knew the bishop. But he also knew the law, and he knew that NJ Holdings donated heavily to the Police Benevolent Fund. I can have a squad car there in 20 minutes, Ms. Thomas. But are you sure you want to do this tonight? There are 100 people in that house. It is going to be a scene. I picked up my clutch and walked toward the elevator. That is exactly the point, Sheriff. They love an audience. I want to make sure they have witnesses when the gavel falls. Meet me at the front gate. And Sheriff, bring the bolt cutters. I have a feeling they changed the locks. I hung up the phone and stepped into the private elevator. The doors slid shut, silencing the quiet hum of my penthouse. As I descended toward the street level, I felt a strange sense of calm. For 29 years, I had been the secret they tried to hide. I was the stain on their perfect picture. Tonight, I was going to be the spotlight. I walked through the lobby, and the valet pulled my matte black Audi up to the curb. The engine growled, as if it knew we were going into battle. I slid into the driver's seat and merged into the holiday traffic. I wasn't driving home. I was driving to a crime scene, and the crime was about to be solved. The driveway of the estate was lined with luxury sedans and SUVs, a testament to the influence my father still wielded. From the street, the house looked like a mausoleum. The windows were dark save for the flickering orange glow of hundreds of candles dancing behind the glass. It didn't look festive. It looked haunted. The deep mechanical roar of industrial generators hidden in the backyard vibrated through the ground, a constant low-frequency reminder that this luxury was being powered by diesel fumes and desperation. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. My mother had clearly raided every home goods store in Atlanta for candles. They were everywhere. Tall pillar candles on the mantel, tea lights lining the staircase, and massive candelabras on the dining table. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and burning wax, mixing unpleasantly with the smell of heavy perfume and hors d'oeuvres. The heating was off, and despite the body heat of 100 guests, a damp chill hung in the air. Guests were keeping their fur coats and cashmere wraps on, nodding politely, when my mother explained that the theme of the evening was a return to simpler, more intimate times. Bishop Thomas stood by the fireplace, the only source of real warmth in the room. He held a crystal glass of sparkling cider, his face illuminated by the firelight. He looked demonic. The shadows cast by the flames danced across his face, accentuating the hollows under his eyes and the tension in his jaw. He was working the room with manic energy. He laughed too loudly. He slapped backs too hard. He was telling a senator that the dim lighting was a choice, a way to focus on the spiritual light of Christmas, rather than the artificial light of the world. It was a brilliant lie delivered with the conviction of a man who had been deceiving his flock for decades. Chloe was holding court on the velvet sofa, wrapped in a white mink stole that probably cost more than the generators. She was playing the role of the fragile, blessed mother-to-be. She touched her stomach constantly, accepting the coos and compliments of the church ladies. In the dim light, you couldn't see the fear in her eyes. You couldn't see the way her hand trembled when she reached for her water glass. She was smiling, but her eyes were darting toward the front door, every few minutes, terrifyingly aware that the peace was fragile. She knew I wasn't done. She knew the power outage was just the opening move. Brad was the only one who wasn't acting well. He was standing near the bar, downing scotch as if it were water. He was sweating despite the cold room. Every time the generator sputtered or the lights flickered, he flinched. He knew what a foreclosure actually meant. He knew that the sheriff didn't take holidays. He was watching the clock, waiting for the inevitable, looking like a rat trying to decide which lifeboat to jump into. The guests, for their part, were starting to whisper. You can only pretend a power outage is a stylistic choice for so long. The toilets weren't flushing properly because the pumps were down. The food was getting cold. The music provided by a string quartet that looked freezing was struggling to drown out the noise of the generators outside. The illusion of wealth was crumbling. I could see the side eyes, the leaned-in conversations behind hands. They smelled blood in the water. They knew something was wrong with the Thomas fortune, but they were too polite or perhaps too entertained by the spectacle to leave just yet. I watched all of this from the screen of my phone as I sat in my car at the end of the block. I had tapped into the security cameras earlier that day before cutting the feed to the house so only I could see the live stream. It was like watching a tragic play. They were dancing on the deck of the Titanic, rearranging the deck chairs while the iceberg loomed. I signaled to Sheriff Miller, whose cruiser was idling silently behind my Audi. The blue and red lights were off for now. I wanted to walk in first. I wanted them to see me in my black dress standing in their candlelight before the law stepped in. I wanted the silence to fall before the storm hit. I checked my makeup in the rearview mirror one last time. Red lips, cold eyes. I looked like the angel of death. I put the car in gear and rolled slowly toward the open gates. The party was over. The heavy oak front doors of the estate swung open with a violence that made the hinges groan. A gust of freezing December wind rushed into the foyer, instantly extinguishing the candles lining the hallway and sending a collective shiver through the room. The sudden draft caused the remaining flames in the living room to dance wildly, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. I stepped across the threshold. The click of my heels on the marble floor was sharp and deliberate, echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence. I wasn't walking, I was gliding. My black silk dress caught the flickering light, making me look like a phantom that had materialized from the darkness. I kept my chin high, looking down at the crowd even though we were on the same level. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The air was sucked out of the space, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Behind me, the illusion of a cozy family gathering was shattered by the arrival of reality. Sheriff Miller stepped into the light, his uniform crisp and intimidating, his hand resting casually near his belt. Flanking him were 6 large movers in gray industrial coveralls. They weren't carrying trays of champagne or hors d'oeuvres. They were carrying stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and rolls of aggressive brown packing tape. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The cellist froze his bow, hovering over the strings, creating an awkward, unfinished silence. The conversation died instantly. 100 heads turned toward the door, 100 pairs of eyes widened in shock. The senators, the pastors, and the socialites stared at the armed officer and the moving crew standing in the foyer of the bishop's home on Christmas Eve. My father, Bishop Thomas, stood by the fireplace, his glass of cider frozen halfway to his mouth. For the first time in his life, he was speechless. His charismatic mask slipped, revealing the terrified old man underneath. My mother, Evelyn, clutched her pearl necklace so tightly I thought the string might snap. She looked from me to the sheriff and back to me, her eyes bulging with panic. She knew. In that split second, she knew exactly what was happening. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I walked to the center of the room, the crowd parting from me like the Red Sea. I stopped in front of the grand staircase and turned to face the guests. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice calm and projecting clearly to the back of the room. "I apologize for the interruption to your festivities. However, there seems to be a misunderstanding regarding the venue. This property has been foreclosed upon and is currently under the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department." A collective gasp went through the room. The whisper network ignited instantly. I continued, my voice turning colder. "The former owners are currently trespassing. I am afraid I have to ask you all to vacate the premises immediately. The locks are being changed in 10 minutes. I turned my gaze to my father. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. I smiled a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Merry Christmas, Bishop. I brought you some boxes. You might want to start with the china." I hear it breaks easily. Sheriff Miller did not shout, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority cutting through the murmurs of the stunned crowd. He unrolled a document stamped with the official seal of the county and held it up to the flickering light of the candelabras. By order of the Superior Court of Fulton County regarding the property at 15 Oak Creek Drive, judgment has been entered in favor of the plaintiff, N.J. Holdings, LLC. The current occupants are hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately. You have 30 minutes to gather essential personal belongings. Anything left after that time will be catalogued as abandoned property. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 second before it was broken by the sound of social suicide. The guests did not wait for an explanation. In the world of the Atlanta elite, scandal was contagious, and nobody wanted to be infected. Senator Davis, who had been laughing at my father's jokes 5 minutes ago, set his wineglass down on a side table and walked briskly toward the door without making eye contact. The church deacons, who had praised the bishop's leadership, were suddenly very interested in their shoes as they shuffled toward the exit. It was a stampede of fur coats and Italian leather. They left their half-eaten appetizers and their half-finished conversations, leaving the Thomas family exposed and alone. My father was the first to break. He stormed toward the sheriff, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is an outrage! You cannot do this! It is Christmas Eve. I am Bishop Thomas. I have rights. This is my house." Sheriff Miller looked at him with the boredom of a man who had heard every excuse in the book. "It was your house, Bishop. Now it is a liability. You have 29 minutes left. I suggest you start packing instead of yelling." My mother, Evelyn, let out a high-pitched wail that sounded like a wounded animal. She looked around the room frantically, her eyes darting from the Persian rug to the crystal vase on the mantel. She lunged for the vase, clutching it to her chest. "This is mine. My grandmother gave this to me. You cannot take my things." One of the movers, a large man with a clipboard, stepped in her path. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall. "I am sorry, ma'am, but the inventory list says all decorative fixtures and antiques were included in the asset forfeiture to cover the outstanding debt." "Put the vase down." Evelyn looked at me, her eyes filled with hate. "Nia, tell them this is a mistake." I looked at her from across the room. I was leaning against the grand piano, watching the dismantling of their lives with a calm detachment. "It is not a mistake, Evelyn. It is a liquidation. You can take your clothes and your toiletries. The vase stays." Chloe was sobbing on the sofa, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. She looked at Brad, expecting him to fix it. "Brad, do something. Call your dad. Call someone. They are kicking us out. My baby needs a nursery." Brad didn't move toward her. He was busy typing furiously on his phone, probably trying to secure a hotel room for himself. He looked up at her with cold, dead eyes. "There is nothing I can do, Chloe. The paperwork is legal. I told you this would happen." He turned and walked out of the room, heading up the stairs to pack his own bags, leaving his pregnant wife sitting alone on the velvet cushions. The movers began to march through the house. The sound of tape guns ripping was the new soundtrack of the evening. They moved with efficient brutality, clearing tables and stacking boxes. I watched my father crumble. He stood in the center of the foyer, watching his congregation flee and his possessions being seized. He looked small. Without the pulpit, without the house, without the audience, he was just an old man with bad credit and a dark secret. Sheriff Miller checked his watch and looked at me. 25 minutes, Ms. Thomas. Do you want us to escort them out physically when the time is up?" I looked at my family scrambling in the candlelight like rats on a sinking ship. "No, Sheriff. Let them walk out on their own. I want them to remember the feeling of leaving through the front door with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It is a lesson they should have learned a long time ago." I turned and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The show was over. The cleanup had begun. The chaos of the eviction was in full swing. My parents were frantically shoving silver picture frames and jewelry boxes into plastic garbage bags. They looked like looters in their own home. But amidst the noise of crumbling legacies, I noticed Brad near the hallway console. He was not packing for Chloe. He was not helping his pregnant wife. He was quietly stuffing his own golf trophies and a box of expensive cigars into a duffel bag. He looked like a rat preparing to swim away from the wreckage. Chloe sat on the edge of the ottoman, her face buried in her hands. She was broken. She had lost her home, her status, and her dignity in the span of 30 minutes. But she still believed she had one thing left. She still believed she had a husband who loved her. She still believed in the fairy tale of her marriage. I looked at her and felt a strange, cold pity. It is cruel to let someone live a lie even if the truth destroys them. I decided to grant her one final mercy. I decided to open her eyes. I pulled my phone out of my clutch. The house was still connected to the central audio system. The backup generator was keeping the Wi-Fi and the smart home features alive, just enough for me to execute this final command. I opened the voice memo app. I selected the file named Le Jardin Lunch. I tapped the AirPlay icon and selected Living Room Main Speakers. A high-pitched digital chime echoed through the high ceilings, signaling that a device had connected. The movers paused. My parents stopped stuffing bags. Brad froze his hand hovering over his bag. He looked at the speakers mounted in the corners of the room, and then he looked at me. His eyes went wide with a primal terror. He knew. I hit play. Brad's voice amplified and crystal clear boomed through the room. It was conversational, casual, and utterly devastating. "You look expensive, Nia. I mean that as a compliment." Chloe lifted her head. She looked confused. She looked at Brad. He was shaking his head, mouthing the word no over and over again. The recording continued, filling the cold room with his betrayal. I realized something this weekend. I married the wrong sister. I thought I was marrying into a dynasty, but I married into a liability. Chloe is a mess, Nia. She is spoiled, she is demanding, and frankly, she is not half the woman you are. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the movers stood still, awkward witnesses to a domestic execution. Chloe stood up slowly. Her face was pale, drained of all blood. She wasn't looking at the speakers anymore. She was staring at Brad with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The voice on the recording laughed. "I want a fresh start. With you. I will leave Chloe. I will file for divorce tomorrow. She can keep the baby and the debt. I want to be on the winning team." I hit pause. The echo of his words seemed to hang in the air like toxic smoke. She can keep the baby and the debt. Brad lunged forward, his hands up in a pathetic gesture of defense. "Chloe, baby, listen to me. That is not real. It is a deep fake. You know what AI can do these days. She made it up. She is trying to tear us apart. You know I love you." He reached for her arm. It was a mistake. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't cry. The shock had bypassed her sadness and tapped directly into a vein of rage she didn't know she possessed. She swung her arm with the full force of her humiliation. The sound of her palm connecting with Brad's cheek was sickeningly loud. It was a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. Brad stumbled back, clutching his face. The imprint of her hand was already turning red on his skin. "You wanted to leave," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury. "You wanted to leave me with the debt. You wanted to leave your child." Brad stammered, looking around the room for an ally, but there were none. My father looked disgusted. My mother looked away. "Get out!" Chloe screamed. The sound tore through her throat. "Get out of my sight! You are trash! You are worse than her!" She pointed a shaking finger at the door. Brad looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with hatred. I just smiled and raised my glass of water in a mock toast. He grabbed his duffel bag and ran out the front door, disappearing into the cold night without looking back. Chloe collapsed back onto the ottoman, sobbing uncontrollably. The fairy tale was dead. The prince was a frog, the castle was foreclosed, and the wicked sister had the keys. I walked over to the console and disconnected my phone. The silence returned, heavy and final. I had stripped them of everything. Their house, their money, their reputation. And now their love. The dismantling was complete. The front door was still open, allowing the winter wind to swirl around the foyer, but the temperature inside the room dropped another 10 degrees when the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers suddenly intensified. Through the open doorway, we could see more vehicles pulling into the driveway. These were not moving trucks. They were marked units. Bishop Thomas was trying to salvage what was left of his dignity. He adjusted his suit jacket and glared at the sheriff. "Fine," he spat. "You have made your point. We are leaving. I will call my lawyers in the morning and we will sue NJ Holdings for wrongful eviction." "Come on, Evelyn. Come on, Chloe. We are going to a hotel." He took a step toward the door, expecting the sheriff to step aside. Sheriff Miller did not move. Instead, he placed a heavy hand on the center of my father's chest and pushed him back. "You are not going to a hotel, Bishop. You are going to the precinct." My father laughed a nervous, incredulous sound. "Excuse me. Am I under arrest for trespassing? This is absurd. I am leaving." "It is not for trespassing," Sheriff Miller said, his voice void of any respect. He reached into his belt and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. The metal glinted in the harsh light of the mover's flashlights. "We have a warrant for your arrest issued by the district attorney's office. The charges are grand larceny, wire fraud, and 18 counts of embezzlement." My mother Evelyn let out a strangled gasp. "Embezzlement. That is a lie. My husband is a man of God." I stepped forward holding a thick file folder. I didn't look at my mother. I looked directly at my father. "You really should have been more careful with the church building fund, Dad. You thought nobody was watching the books because you fired the accountant last year. But you forgot that when I bought the mortgage, I also bought the right to audit the previous owner's liquidity sources. I hired a forensic accountant 3 weeks ago." I opened the file and held up a spreadsheet. It was color-coded. It showed transfers from the Greater Hope Cathedral charity account directly into Bishop Thomas's personal offshore holding in the Cayman Islands. $3 million, I said calmly. "You stole $3 million from the people who sit in your pews every Sunday. You took the widow's mite and used it to pay for your gambling debts and your mistress's silence. You didn't just fail to fix the roof. You stole the roof." My father's face went gray. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the fight had left him. He knew I had the bank routing numbers. He knew I had the emails. Just then, the front door opened again. 2 deputies marched in, dragging a struggling figure between them. It was Brad. He had made it as far as the end of the driveway before the perimeter units intercepted him. He was already cuffed, his hands behind his back, his expensive suit disheveled. He looked terrified. "And here is your co-conspirator," I said, gesturing to my brother-in-law. Brad thought he was clever, hiding the transactions as consulting fees. He was the one who set up the shell companies, right, Brad? That was the deal. You cook the books for the bishop, and he pays for your lifestyle. Brad looked at Chloe, who was staring at him with dead eyes. "Chloe, I was just doing what I was told," he pleaded. "He forced me." "Shut up, Brad!" Sheriff Miller barked. The sheriff turned my father around. "Bishop Thomas, put your hands behind your back." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was louder than a gunshot. Click, click. It was the sound of a kingdom falling. The great Bishop Thomas, the untouchable patriarch, was suddenly just a prisoner. Evelyn was screaming now, clinging to his arm. "You cannot take him. He has a heart condition. He has a greed condition, ma'am," the sheriff said, gently peeling her fingers off the bishop's sleeve. "And if you knew about the money, I suggest you get a very good lawyer too, because we are looking into accomplices." Evelyn froze, terrified, into silence. The deputies began to lead them out. My father walked past me, his head bowed. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. The shame was too absolute. Brad was dragged out behind him, weeping openly. I walked to the doorway and watched them go. The driveway was a sea of red and blue lights. Neighbors were standing on their lawns, filming with their phones. The bishop was being guided into the back of a squad car, his head pushed down to protect it from the doorframe. Brad was shoved into another. I turned back to the empty house. Chloe was still sitting on the ottoman staring at the wall in a catatonic state. My mother was standing in the middle of the foyer surrounded by boxes looking small and old. They were the survivors of the wreckage, but they were not free. I walked over to the security panel on the wall. I punched in the code to arm the system. "You two have 5 minutes to leave," I said, checking my watch. "The police are done. The movers are done. And I am done." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out past them down the steps and toward my car. The air was cold and clean. I took a deep breath. It smelled like winter. It smelled like justice. For the first time in 29 years, the monster wasn't under my bed. He was in the back of a police car, and I was the one holding the keys to the castle. Before the deputy could shove my father's head into the back seat of the cruiser, I raised my hand. "Wait, Sheriff," I said, walking calmly toward the vehicle. "I think the bishop deserves a proper send-off." Sheriff Miller hesitated, but nodded, signaling the deputy to pause. My father stood there, cuffed and humiliated, his eyes fixed on the ground. He refused to look at me. He wanted to preserve the last shred of his denial. But I wasn't going to let him. I stepped into his personal space close enough that I could smell the stale fear sweat mixing with his expensive cologne. I reached out and adjusted his collar, smoothing the fabric with a mock tenderness. I leaned in until my lips were brushing his ear. The cameras from the neighbors couldn't hear this. The sheriff couldn't hear this. This was just for him. "I know, Dad." I whispered, my voice soft and lethal. "I ran the DNA test. I know Chloe is not your daughter. I know she belongs to another man. And I know that you have known it for 26 years. I felt his body seize up. A tremor ran through him as if he had touched a live wire. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of hatred and recognition. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a disappointment. He was looking at his equal. I continued my whisper, relentless and cold. "You treated your own flesh and blood like garbage to protect a lie. You raised a bastard like a princess because she was the pretty little mask you wore to hide your shame. But guess what, Bishop? The mask is off. I have the papers. And while you are sitting in that cell awaiting trial, I am going to release them to the press. Everyone is going to know. The embezzlement is bad, but the cuckoldry, that is what will truly destroy you. You are not a patriarch. You are a punchline." I pulled back and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "Goodbye, Dad. Don't drop the soap." Bishop Thomas made a sound that wasn't quite human. It was a gurgling choke of pure, impotent rage. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged at me, but the cuffs and the deputy held him back. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the night air. It came from the porch. We all turned to see Evelyn. She had been standing near the doorway, listening, watching the exchange. She might not have heard the words, but she saw the look on his face. She knew the nuclear bomb had just detonated. "My husband! Oh my God, my heart!" She shrieked, clutching her chest with theatrical desperation. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the cold concrete porch in a heap of faux fur and pearls. It was a perfect faint. Too perfect. She landed in a way that protected her head and displayed her anguish for the neighbors' cameras. Chloe screamed, rushing to her mother's side. "Mom! Mom, wake up! Help her!" The paramedics who were on standby for the elderly guests rushed forward. I didn't move. I stood by the police car watching the performance. My mother wasn't having a heart attack. She was executing an exit strategy. She would rather go to the hospital than face the questions. She would rather be the victim than the villain. Sheriff Miller looked at me, his eyebrows raised. "Do you want to ride in the ambulance with her, Ms. Thomas?" I looked at Evelyn's fluttering eyelids. "No, Sheriff. I have a business to run. Besides, she is a survivor. Cockroaches always are." I turned my back on the flashing lights, the screaming sister, and the fainting mother. I walked to my car and got in. The rearview mirror showed a scene of absolute devastation, and I had never seen anything so beautiful. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The flashing red and blue lights painted the scene in a strobe effect of madness, making the driveway look like a twisted carnival. My father, Bishop Thomas, did not get into the car quietly. The whisper I had planted in his ear was a spark that ignited 26 years of compressed gasoline. He stopped fighting the deputies and turned his body violently toward the porch, where my mother Evelyn was miraculously recovering from her faint. "You witch!" he roared. The sound was guttural and raw, tearing through the polite silence of the neighborhood. He lunged toward her, straining against the handcuffs so hard that the metal bit into his wrists, drawing blood. "You ruin everything. I protected you. For 30 years, I protected you and your bastard child." Evelyn scrambled backward on the concrete, her pearl necklace snapping and scattering beads across the porch like hail. She looked terrified not of the police, but of the man she had manipulated for decades. "Thomas, stop it. You are delirious. The stress is too much." "Shut up!" he screamed, spitting the words out. "Do not talk to me about stress. I went to prison for you. I stole that money to pay for the lifestyle you demanded. And for what? So you could parade that mistake around as my daughter." He turned his wild eyes toward Chloe, who was standing frozen by the door, clutching her stomach. She looked like a ghost. She looked like a child watching a nightmare. "And you!" he yelled at her, his voice cracking with venom. "You are nothing to me. Do you hear me? Nothing. You are the daughter of a pool boy. Every time I looked at you, I wanted to vomit. I hope you end up on the street. I hope you starve. You are a curse on my house." Chloe let out a sound that broke my heart just a fraction. It was a high, thin wail of absolute abandonment. "Daddy, please," she begged, reaching out a trembling hand. "I am not your father," he bellowed, as the deputies finally shoved him into the back seat. "I never was. Ask your mother who she was sleeping with while I was preaching the gospel. Ask her whose blood you have." The deputy slammed the car door shut, cutting off the stream of profanity, but we could still see him through the window, thrashing and screaming silently against the glass. The illusion was gone. The perfect Thomas family was not just broken. It was atomized. Evelyn sat amidst the scattered pearls, weeping into her hands. Her secret was out. The neighbors had heard it. The police had heard it. Chloe stood alone in the cold wind, looking from the police car to her mother, realizing that her entire identity had been a fabrication. She wasn't the princess. She was the cover-up. I stood by my car watching the final act of this tragedy. It was ugly, it was loud, it was violent, and it was the most honest moment this family had ever experienced. They were finally screaming the things they had whispered for years. The veneer of civility had been stripped away, leaving only the rotting wood underneath. I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, heavy finality. I opened my car door and slid into the leather seat. The heat was on. The music was soft. I put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving the screaming and the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. The house was empty. The stage was cleared. And I was the only one left standing when the curtain fell. The last red taillight of the sheriff's cruiser disappeared around the curve of the driveway, taking the chaos with it. The sirens faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of the wind through the old oak trees. I stood on the porch for a moment longer, just breathing. The air was crisp and cold, biting at my exposed skin, but I didn't shiver. I felt a heat radiating from my core, the adrenaline of absolute conquest. I turned around and faced the open maw of the house. Without the candles, without the people, without the pretension, it was just a building of stone and glass. I stepped inside. The foyer echoed with the sound of my heels on the marble. It was a hollow, lonely sound, but to me it sounded like ownership. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. It was cold to the touch. I pulled it shut. The heavy wood swung on its hinges and closed with a deep, resonant thud that shook the floorboards. I threw the deadbolt. Click. I engaged the security chain. Clatter. I punched the code into the alarm panel. Beep. The little green light turned red. Armed, I was sealed in. I walked slowly into the living room. The movers had been efficient, the personal clutter was gone. The room was stripped bare of their influence, leaving only the furniture that legally belonged to the estate. It looked like a museum after closing hours. I walked past the spot where Evelyn had fainted. I walked past the fireplace where the bishop had crumbled. I could still smell the faint scent of extinguished wax and expensive perfume, but the ventilation system was already cycling it out, replacing it with the sterile, neutral smell of filtered air. I made my way to the wet bar in the corner. Brad had left a bottle of single malt scotch on the counter uncorked in his panic. I picked it up. It was heavy, expensive, and paid for with stolen money. I found a crystal tumbler and poured 3 fingers of the amber liquid. I didn't add ice. I wanted the burn. I turned around and leaned against the bar, looking out over my kingdom. It was vast. It was dark. And it was completely empty. People like my mother always said that revenge is a hollow pursuit. They warned that if you seek an eye for an eye, you end up blind. They were wrong. My vision had never been clearer. They told me that money couldn't buy happiness, and that driving away your family would leave you with a hole in your heart. I took a sip of the scotch. It was smooth, smoky, and warmed my throat like liquid fire. I looked around the silent room. There was no one to judge me here, no one to lie to me, no one to steal from me, no one to tell me I wasn't good enough. Yes, the room was empty. Yes, the silence was absolute. But it wasn't the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of peace. I had surgically removed the cancer that had been eating at my life for 29 years. I walked to the center of the room, my shadow stretching long and thin across the floor. I was the villain in their story, but I was the hero in mine. I had won the game. I had taken the board, the pieces, and the table. I raised the glass in a toast to the darkness, to the silence, to the girl who used to cry in the closet, and to the woman who now owned the house. I took the final swallow, draining the glass. I lowered it and let a small, genuine smile curve my lips. It was a cold smile, sharp as a blade. I was alone. Finally, gloriously alone. Nia's story teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. Family is defined by loyalty, not just DNA. When those closest to you weaponize your love and sabotage your potential, walking away isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of survival. Financial independence provided Nia the shield she needed to protect her peace and the sword to cut ties with toxicity. It reminds us that your value is not determined by how others treat you, but by what you build for yourself. Sometimes the only way to find your light is to turn off their power. Subscribe now for more gripping tales of betrayal, revenge, and the ruthless pursuit of justice.